It's really, truly, truly my honor to introduce Dr. Clementine Collett. She's a Braid Fellow at the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy, and she's principal investigator. She's the lead on this project, co-designing responsible technology and policy for the impact of generative AI on the writing and publishing of the novel. This is the project that's led to this report, and this has been in partnership with the Institute for the Future of Work. She's her doctorate's from the University of Oxford, and it explored gender bias in AI recruitment technology, investigating how these systems really impact the hiring process and equality. Previously, she's worked in consulting and business research, and we worked together on a report on women's work in AI, the impact of AI on women's work that we published with the OECD and UNESCO. Now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Collett to talk you through the reports. Welcome. Collett.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction, Gina, and for chairing today, and indeed for your support with this research. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much to everyone joining from near and far. Particular thanks to Kate Mosse and Richard Coombs for being part of this launch discussion. I'm really, really excited for the next bit being your responses and then our panel. So I really won't spend too long on this presentation, but I just want to give a brief overview of the research, hopefully about 10 to 12 minutes, including the findings and the recommendations. And I should also start by expressing my gratitude to everyone who has made this research possible, with most particular thanks to the participants and to the AHRC and Braid UK for funding this research, to the Minderoo Centre for housing me, and for the IFOW for partnering with me. So the context of this report is that the creative industries are going through a tumultuous time due to the rise of generative AI, and there are ongoing debates and legal cases around the training and the capabilities of these systems. But this research focuses on the novel in particular and aims to investigate how Gen AI is being used by literary creatives and how it is impacting them already, as well as thoughts about the future of this precious art form that we've developed as humans. Novels are a significant bedrock of the creative industries. They provide the basis for films, TV shows, music, and so much more. And our creative industries bring in 126 billion gross value added to the UK economy each year. The publishing industry alone bringing in 11 billion. Novels are so valuable for our economy, it's true, but more than that, they are precious and vital for our development, connection with one another, well-being, entertainment, education, and identity, to name a few. So this research aims to kind of give novelists and the publishing industry a voice in this turbulent time. And I think the findings are very powerful and show a real cry from the heart of the industry about the existing impacts and the future of the art form. So the research data, I gathered this data with literary creatives across the UK. And that was through focus groups in Edinburgh, Manchester, and London. This included published novelists, fiction publishers, and literary agents for fiction. There was also a major survey with these groups. And I also conducted case studies with translators, audiobook narrators, ghostwriters, novelists who are using generative AI to various extents as well. In addition, there were interviews with industry and policy experts, as well as a multi-stakeholder forum in Cambridge, which brought together kind of all of these groups to discuss the findings. So in terms of the key findings around the uses, just to whiz through, the main thing here is that most literary creatives say that they are not using Gen AI within their writing processes. We see that over 2/3 of novelists say they never use Gen AI, and about the same with literary agents, with slightly fewer in publishing saying that they never use Gen AI. And the reasons given for this involve, the moral and environmental implications of using generative AI, the negative perception of using it for creative tasks, and concerns around the inaccuracies of AI as well. And also some worry about the copyright of content in terms of output. The people who were using it were largely using it for tasks that they deemed non-creative, with the most common use being for information search. In terms of the impacts, there are kind of three umbrellas under which these impacts come. That is social, literary, and economic. But to give a few of the headlines, socially, the big concern from across the industry was about what this increased use of AI is doing to our creativity and skills, particularly around things like empathy, problem solving, and critical thinking, and also worry about destroying trust and connection between writers and readers, which was seen to be a really core part of the function of the novel in the first place. And there was worry from writers as well that readers might stop trusting their content produced wholly by them, and that this might kind of damage or taint their reputation as writers, and again, their relationship with readers. Also, obviously, concerned that books written using generative AI in part or whole would not have that same humanity and ability to connect with readers. So while there were seen to be some opportunities around helping to facilitate access to quite an exclusive industry and to bring in new voices, there were also concerns around the discriminatory output which Gen AI can produce. In terms of the literary impacts, this mainly revolved around a loss of originality in literature in terms of content, style, and language of novels due to an increased use of Gen AI in writing and publishing, and the way that this AI currently functions under the pretense of kind of predictability rather than the novelty. Also around genres, there was discussion about which genres were most threatened. It was seen to be genre fiction such as romance, thrillers, and crime, which were most likely to be displaced by generative AI. But and literary fiction to be kind of the least likely to be displaced. But of course, there's an interesting discussion to be had here about the assumptions that this is based on, in terms of genre fiction being seen to be more formulaic, but actually possessing many elements of novelty and surprise, and also the fact that we don't know what generative AI systems will be able to do in the future in terms of their capabilities. In terms of the economic impacts, many reported negative impact on their income. So, and due directly to generative AI, I should say. This was for a really wide range of reasons that this 39% of novelists reported their income have been negatively impacted by Gen AI. But most commonly, it was because of losing supplementary streams of income, which they use to support their writing, or because they say their books have been used to train AI models, which they feel are now competing with their own books. In some cases, authors also speak about finding AI slot books online under their name or on various platforms, which they feel are jeopardizing their sales, or also AI bots leaving them bad reviews, mixing up their character names, the storylines, and so on, and again, jeopardizing their sales and their future reputation. In terms of the future impact on income, there was a very high number thinking that their income would be negatively impacted. About 85% said this of novelists. And they believe that it is likely that, about 51% of these published novelists also agree that it is likely that AI is going to displace their work entirely, with many citing the reasons that I just went through around the current impacts. People thinking that these will get worse, especially as AI models become more sophisticated. Also, due to how AI is kind of generally changing our psychology, our attention spans, our interests, and there might be increased appetite for the kind of short form content consumption rather than long form, meaning that we might kind of lose significant audience numbers, as well as some thinking that maybe publishers will start to move to increasingly using AI to write if financial pressures on the industry increase. And lastly, the key findings on copyright. So again, I'll keep this short and maybe we can go into it in the Q&A if people wish to. But really, there was a call for reinforcing existing copyright law through fostering a fair, accessible, and effective licensing market. And moreover, given recent case law, this report calls for the government to continue to review whether copyright law in the UK is fit for purpose. And there might potentially be need for legislative reform to clarify the law and to further protect creatives. The report also calls for the mandate of granular transparency and fair remuneration for the use of creatives' work in the training of AI models, which is something that was, a view that was widely held throughout the creatives who were surveyed and spoken to in focus groups, and for an investment in and encouragement of the development of responsible AI in the UK. So ways to kind of incentivize that responsible AI development, which uses licensed data and is less harsh on the environment, so that publishers and writers can still responsibly reap the benefits of emerging technologies. In terms of education as well, the report argues, that in the age of AI, it's really imperative that children are given space. Sorry, I've moved on to the recommendations. It's really imperative that children are given space at school to write without the use of AI, to daydream and to develop the skills to be critical of AI, as well as to be literate in how to use the technologies, and to kind of fund creative writing and independent publishers to counter the risks of Gen AI around that homogeneity of voices centered in AI content. And in terms of the publishing industry recommendations, this report calls for increased industry transparency around the use of AI in-house to ensure that if licensing is going through publishers, that split is fair and that it's licensed as a sub-right as if it were a translation right or a film right. And also for increased support around AI use and contracts, particularly for independent publishers and self-published authors. So this is a real whistle-stop tour of the report and is very high level, but I hope it gives you a kind of an idea of some of the findings, and the full report and the shorter policy brief can both be found online on the Minderoo Centre website.
Thank you for that, Clemmy. Great to hear straight from your report. I've got the honor of introducing our two panelists. First, let us welcome to our conversation Kate Mosse, CBE. Kate is a novelist, a writer, a campaigner, and a broadcaster. She is the author of 11 novels and short story collections, including bestsellers like the Joe Bird Family Chronicles, the multi-million selling Languedoc trilogy, forgive me, I can't say that word, and Gothic fiction, including Winter Ghosts and The Taxidermist's Daughter. Kate's work's been translated into 38 languages and published in more than 40 countries. She's written four works of nonfiction, including her memoir about Bearing, An Extra Pair of Hands, and Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, How Women Also Built the World. Kate is the founder-director of the Women's Prize for Fiction and the Women's Prize for Nonfiction, the largest annual celebration of women's writing in the world, and is the founder of the global campaign #WomanInHistory to honor, celebrate, and promote women's achievements throughout history. I'd also like to welcome Richard Combs, Head of Rights and Licensing and Deputy Chief Executive at the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society. His work at the ALCS focuses on the development of collective rights and licensing schemes in the UK and internationally, aimed at providing writers with fair remuneration for their reuse of their work. Richard's department is also responsible for engaging with UK and EU policy on copyright and authors' rights, and he represents ALCS on the boards of the British Copyright Council and the Educational Recording Agency, of which he's currently vice chair. Welcome, Kate and Richard. Kate, let's start with you. Your thoughts, reflections. I know you've been quite involved in thinking through, what's the future of the novel and what's the future for supporting novelists to do their best work. How do you think about this report?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be joining everybody today to launch this, because it's so important. And the report, and I commend it to everybody who's part of this, either listening now or will listen in the future, because it lays out precisely where we are in these discussions, and the fact that they are complicated. And it makes it very clear through Clemmie's amazing work, but also the huge range of people that have spoken within this, who don't always agree with each other, that firstly, it is complicated. Now, this is the third technological revolution. It is a seismic thing that is happening at the moment. And AI is here to stay. There's, you can't be against AI. It's a thing. It just exists. But there is a nuance that has been missing in a lot of conversations. And there has also been, I would suggest, a quite deliberate attempt in the earlier days of these discussions on behalf of the technology companies who are selling generative AI for their own profit, essentially, to give the impression that it's too complicated for most people to understand. And consequently, whenever one raises any kind of question, the pushback is, well, you're a Luddite. Now, what this report does is say that that's not the right question. It's not about whether you're a Luddite or not. It's about analyzing pros and the cons, the uses and the misuses, and coming somewhere. So what struck me, there were many things that struck me, and I've read the report several times now. All the data is there in terms of the amount that the creative industry is 126 billion per year to the economy. All of those kind of things are there. But the most important things I would say are some of the phrases like, this is not anti-innovation, it's pro-responsibility. The word responsibility appears several times, and I think that is critical. It is oddly not complicated at all, on the one hand, in that there is no other area where it would be remotely possible for somebody to steal our work as novelists to make profit out of it without permission, without recompense, without remuneration. It just wouldn't happen. These are huge industries and they pay everybody else. So that is at the base of it, that a lot of what is happening in generative AI is theft. That's not complicated. Everybody can understand that. What I do love about the report is that there are recommendations. There is a clear explanation. You have been listening to people in the industry and beyond, and obviously what Richard is doing at the ALCS and all of it is so critical. There has been great industry support from this, and the Society of Authors and many other trade bodies have been very involved in this. But the fact that there are clear recommendations, I think, is really important, because there hasn't been a unifying battle cry, if you like. There's been too many little bits of somebody is arguing about this, somebody is arguing about something else. It's very clear that we need unity. And another word that comes up a lot through the report is the lack of consistency. Consistency is a word that comes up a lot. I think that the recommendations of, particularly in schools, AI-free writing is very important. I think that teaching AI skills is critical. I've just come back from speaking about AI at a publishing and library conference in Dubai. And most of the voices were from outside of Europe. And it was very clear to me that we are in a very, very different place from a lot of the rest of the world on this. But one of the things that they have done in Dubai is that they have chosen from all sectors of the community 1 million people to be trained as expert AI users. And they are women and men, they are people from different communities, different levels of education, all of these things. So an understanding that without teaching everybody how to use AI, how to spot its misuses and problems, then many of the conversations we're having make no sense at all, because people can't distinguish between useful AI, positive AI, transformational AI, and theft. Generative AI basically is theft. Another thing that comes out in the report, which I think is very, very important, is the idea that publishing as an industry has to get its house in order pretty quickly, which it has not done. So are we going to ask for books to be branded AI free? Or, very much my preference, that books that are produced by generative AI should have that on the cover. I think, and I'm at odds with some of my colleagues on this, I do not think it is up to writers to say what we are not. I think writers are the origin story. We are the basis of all of this, as the report makes clear, that without us, there is nothing to steal. So the idea that we now have to say that our books are written by a human, I think is giving in, if you like. And we should be absolutely asking that the publishing industry should be saying any book that is substantively written by generative AI should have that stamp on the cover. People will say it's impossible, but people said that about food standards. And here we are. You know, nothing is impossible. It's about finding the mechanism to do it. In terms of how these things, you know, it's very clear, we know this all the way through, that creatives are radically opposed to an opt-out, because it's an example of what we're doing now. I'm delivering a new book at the end of next week. I should be writing that book now. But I'm here talking about AI because it matters to all writers. We've all got to speak up now before it's too late. What the opt-out is basically saying is, you won't have time to do your work because you will have to be seeking around the place to discover if your work has been stolen. So the work that's going on from the ALCS and the Society of Authors and others about the how inappropriate that is very important. And of course, there has been a victory along that line, that the government has kind of accepted that that isn't the way to do it. I think a final point before we listen to Richard and then we open up more generally is this. Are there things about AI that will support and help creativity and publishing as an industry? Yes. There is no doubt the number crunching, in particular, the analytical skills in particular, will be very significant in things like marketing. Are there issues already about translation and AI translation that is then handed over essentially to a human who is, if you like, slightly demoted into the role of a copy editor? Yes, that is already happening. Are there going to be issues about jacket design being possibly used by AI? I know this is outside the novel, but every novel has a jacket on it and it's part of the industry. Yes, of course. But if we look on the core emotion, if you like, behind Clemmie's report, the idea that the novel matters, that it is a unique human driver in empathy, in standing in other people's shoes, in seeing the world differently, in speaking up against tyranny, speaking up against homogenous attitudes. Yes. If we only have copycat work that's produced by generative AI, every single time that happens, it will be diluted just a little bit. Many people listening will have read the wonderful novel, The Thief of Time by Terry Pratchett, where the creatures, the people within it, take apart a priceless work of art to make themselves understand what it is that makes it a perfect work of art. And they put it back together exactly the same, but yet the spirit has been lost. And that is the issue at the heart of generative AI. And I did say it was a final thing, but there's one final thing, is about the mechanisms within which we can take on the tech companies who are stealing our work. The first is, having been talking about this for a year and speaking in the House of Lords and speaking to a lot of ministers, it is very clear that the only thing that the people understand, if you like, is money, which means that going to law, like Anthropic has done, and actually there's a case in Germany just yesterday that has been won, that will be more effective than appealing to the idea of honor and responsibility. Secondly, I have been very, very surprised by how little conversation there is at the heart of every discussion about AI, about the inbuilt misogyny, particularly, but prejudice across the board. When I did do a test to something I knew the answer to, because as we know, a lot of AI, which is not generative AI, but the systems that people are using like ChatGPT, I knew the answer. So I knew that I would know if it was right or wrong, and often it's wrong. But I put in a simple question. Tell me who has won the Booker Prize for fiction more than once. And the answer is there are two women who have and 2 men who have. When the answer came up, there was a paragraph on each of the male authors and a sentence on each of the female authors. And speaking to young people within the teaching of AI skills about the environmental impact, which is catastrophic, in not least of all the inbuilt obsolescence, you know, the kind of litter that is coming, not just the water use and the electricity use, but many young people have absolutely no idea that the huge majority, somewhere in the 90s, nobody quite knows who, of programmers of generative AI, as well as other forms of AI, are young men of a certain profile between a certain age. This is radically changing the world, or will do. So anything, whether it's about the novel that we're talking about, or it has to be taught within the context of the broader story of AI, so that every time a young person or anybody uses AI, they are aware of the other consequences of doing it. We know at the moment that one AI search uses 300 times as much energy as one Google search. So people need to know what they're using before we can have these very important conversations at the heart of Clemmy's report. But I think this report will be hugely important in the next generation of discussions that we're going to all be having in the months to come. So thank you very much, Clemmy, and to the Institute for being part of this.
Thank you. Let's bring Richard in. Before I turn to Richard, though, I want to remind you that we have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and please put questions for the panel. We'll get to those in just a moment. So Richard, you've been keeping very busy around what the policies should be that support rights holders. This can be a really complicated issue for a lot of people, but Kate used a word, theft. Is it right for us to be thinking about what's going on now as theft? And how, from your position at ALCS, are you thinking about what we can do to ensure that there is a future for the novel?
Thanks, Gina, and also congratulations to me and the team for a really excellent and I think what will prove to be very timely piece of work. I saw a lot in the report that resonated with what our members told us when we did our survey with them last summer, and it got by far the biggest response of any survey we've ever done with members, which tells us that this is a matter that novelists, but all writers, are very clearly engaged with and concerned about. And to be honest, you can't really blame them, given how this began with this great scrape over a number of years, covertly by tech companies faking works without any notice, and as Kate said, without permission, credit, or remuneration. And I think novelists perhaps will be particularly wary given the potential for displacement and competition with their work. And I'm always a bit fascinated and bemused by why there is this fixation on creative adjacent AI outputs. There was a storm earlier in the year when a ChatGPT generated piece of metafiction was published, and there were acres of coverage about that. But at the same time, there were any number of interesting AI-powered advances in medical research techniques, which we didn't hear so much about, which tells me that our priorities are significantly off kilter. What does society really need from this new technology? Expediting the process of curing diseases? 100%. Algorithmic literature? Not so much. And I think the three areas that really resonated from our own, what we heard from our members, are around transparency, compensation, and licensing. And I think transparency is a point on which pretty much everyone's agreed on the what I might broadly call the rights holder side, so the creators, but also the commercial rights holders, the publishers, the record companies, the film companies, etc. Transparency is the starting point, it's first base really for this, and yet 3 years after that first release of ChatGPT, regulation is lagging globally. The EU AI Act the measures aren't perfect in there, but even that has had the sort of brakes put on it a bit by pressure from the US tech companies. And the policy there is pretty much let it rip, I think, in terms of those companies from its own administration. Scrape, baby scrape, we might say. So what is the objection to transparency? Quite often we hear the argument that this will increase competition. They need to keep secret their own models. And it was interesting when DeepSeek emerged earlier in the year, there was a howl of protest from the tech companies about the theft of their IP. It's often said that AI can't do comedy, but it clearly struggles with irony as well. So compensation, the answer perhaps to the great scrape, if not necessarily what happens going forward. And as Kate said, the Anthropic settlement has sort of started the ball rolling a bit, but we need to remind ourselves that the actual legal judgment there was really on what we might call old school copyright infringement. They'd used pirate copies of works from these dark corners of the web that have been around for decades. The big question, the sort of legal issue that everyone's grappling with in terms of the actual training, fine-tuning, other uses of works to make these systems do what they do, we still have to keep fighting that uphill battle. And there was a good judgment recently in Germany on the so-called text and data mining exception and its scope. But I think we're going to have to keep going all the way uphill to the Supreme Court and the Court of Justice in Europe. And it's likely that that will take years. And while that's happening, successive waves of technology will no doubt wash over us and over the creative sector. But we have to stay the course on the original sin of all of that training and not get sidetracked, as happened in the past with things like the Google Books settlement. So to briefly touch on what ALCS is doing, so compensation is for what happens in the past, but looking at future uses, the report singled out small language models, ethical, and that's the bit of the forest that we're currently exploring with our partners in the Copyright Licensing Agency and Publishers Licensing Services. We're not really looking towards sort of fictive genres. I think the first licenses that we'd look to explore would be more around professional business, academia type works that are aimed at specific sectors. And as I say, sort of small language models, perhaps even bespoke language models that deliver particular answers in a certain bit of the market. Our mantra in all of that is test and learn. And things like what kind of data can be provided on use? How can that inform the way that we fairly and thoughtfully can allocate money between authors and publishers, between different authors of different works? All of that stuff that we've been doing within ALCS for decades, but we need to feel our way carefully into this new world and make sure that we can apply those same rules and techniques there. The obvious virtue of licensing, and the word control popped up a lot in the report, and consent is incredibly important, and choice as well. And with a license, you do get to set the terms rather than playing catch up, as is the case with the scraping and the compensation. And just one example of a term that we've looked at in the model license that we're developing is a prohibition on any outputs which mimic or plagiarize authors' works, and getting rid of the dreaded write me something in the style of prompt. And that is what you have with licensing. You can actually set the rules from the get-go. So the UK policy debate will probably start again, I wouldn't say in earnest, but it will start again in a few weeks when the government releases an interim report that was one of the hard-won concessions within the Data Act. And we'll get a sense then of perhaps where their assessments are on options, although I suspect we'll be well into next year before we hear something meaningful. But I think the report is incredibly timely for that reason, because after all, novelists and people who read novels, and indeed creators and their audiences, are all real human people. Critically, we're all constituents. And I think this good hard evidence from our sector about how people feel about the direction that policy is taking is something that we really do need to continue providing a platform for authors and other creators to have their voices heard, but also, as Clemmy was touching on, the impact on audiences as well, and the general direction of travel that generative AI content takes us in.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Richard. We've got questions coming in at a good clip. I'm going to remind everybody to get your questions in on that Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen. Clemmy, I want to launch our questions just briefly by saying, kind of back to you. You know, this is such a rich report, and your presentation gives us a really great sense of the overall view. But one of the things I love about the work is how much the authors' voices are in there. What surprising or interesting thing did you hear from the people at the center of this?
That's a great question, Gina. And I should start by saying thank you so much to Kate and Richard for those absolutely unbelievable responses. It's such a privilege to have you here, and thank you for your wonderful points and support of this work. It means a lot. Yeah, I think some of the kind of, there were some surprising things that came out. Like I think that during the focus groups, what was interesting was when people started to talk about the fact that they were using AI, because I do think there was a sort of underlying sense that maybe that was a taboo subject. And once someone started to say, oh, I do use it in these ways and I do find it helpful, others might begin to agree with that. And I think that picks up on the nuance point that Kate was bringing in about how, you know, there are useful ways that these technologies can be used by creatives. And 80% of these literary creatives who are surveyed are saying that they think AI has enormous benefits in society in some areas and not others. And there are ways that they find these technologies useful. They just want them to be responsibly designed, and they want their data to be, you know, they want to give consent for its use. They want to be remunerated, and they want these companies to be transparent. I think also a sort of small fact, a nugget that surprised me and that I thought was a great point from one of the participants, was what it will do to our preferences as readers in terms of our trust in the content. And something that's interesting to think about is whether it might send us back to more classics, or whether it might steer us towards more experimental fiction, which readers might think it's less likely that this has been written using or in part using generative AI. I think those are a couple of interesting things.
I'm going to launch with questions from the audience, and thank you, audience. Keep those coming. And this is really, I think, for all three of you to take on. David Grundy asks, kind of talks about some of those labeling projects and as being wholly insufficient to provide readers with ethical, actionable, and transparent information about the extent to which generative AI has been involved in their purchase. How do we move forward to a place where customers know what they're buying? Who should be lobbied? How do novelists organize? And I open that up to any of you. I also kind of, as we're talking about that, Sarah Hall talks about how large institutions can help support creatives and their own employees working in creative roles, and specifically calls out the BBC as well as being one of those places that could be doing more. So how do people get involved in thinking through this issues? Kate or Richard?
Just on the sort of flood of AI generated books, in quotes, that's been coming onto the market for quite a while now. I guess there's self-regulation, but that has its limitations. I think I think Amazon changed its conditions for self-published books a while back, but I think the limit was changed to something like you can only publish 3 books a day. I know we've taken other Kate's time, but she'll have to get back to doing the other 2 this afternoon. I mean, self-regulation, that's the limits of that. At the end of the government consultation, once we got through all of the generative AI bit, there were questions about whether there was a role for government in actual regulation of things like that. And we probably need to keep side for that when the government conversation starts again. So I think that's a critical point, not just about sort of consumer protection, but general competition with legitimate products that authors have got out there in the market. And that's before you get into the sort of copycat things and things like that.
I think I mentioned it. I mean, I think that we are coming to a time where we're going to need to have the equivalent of a kite mark on it, but it's just that I believe that it's the AI companies need to announce that they are AI. I don't think it's authors should announce. The burden is on authors to announce because we're the ones that are losing out. But publishing knows that they've got to get a grip on this. You know, the second part of the question about bigger institutions, I think that every institution, whoever they are, is grappling with this, as Clemmy says in the report, the lack of consistency. This does in the end have to come from the government saying, this is how we as a nation, even though this is a global issue, are going to address these things. With the Women's Prize, for example, we have slightly modified our entry rules and regs. And we say, you know, as it always has been, but we make it very clear that it's got to be a unified work of fiction of more than 30,000 words written by a single author. Therefore, by definition, a book written by AI is not eligible because it is not by a single author, which is very pertinent point about plagiarism and copycats. These things have always existed. You know, I had a moment a couple of years ago where I had 2 books in the Russian top 10. One was the official version of my novel, and one was a pirate copy that I had never seen till it appeared on there. And of course, at the time, that was quite funny. But it is obviously now we are in a moment of crisis. So I think it's about, you know, it's going to come down to a kite mark thing so that people know the thing that we cannot legislate for, and in a way, is it up to us to do this? If readers don't care if it's been written by a machine, then that is their right. That, you know, that is the thing that I think publishing has to grapple with. That for people who want loads and loads of books that are pretty much exactly the same as each other, and they want to read them voraciously, they aren't going to care whether it's been written by a human or AI. And we just need, as an industry, to just acknowledge that it's not that if everybody knows it's a book's written by AI, they're going to turn their back on it. They're not. If they're very, very cheap and they're following a particular, and I suspect that there are a few books, I don't know if Richard agrees with this, and we would never name names because we're ladies and gentlemen, but I would imagine that there are some books out there that are very high profile that are actually odd AI that we don't quite know, or at least hasn't been revealed yet. I'm sure that they are already there.
I'm going to bring in a question from Peter Bannister here because this seems like an appropriate time. And again, any of you jump in. Does AI generated fiction change what we think novels are for?
I might take a first bat at that. I think it's a great question. Thank you so much, Peter. Yes, something that this relates to within the research is how much novelists and people working in publishing spoke about what the novel is for. And the word that kept coming up was humanity and connection. And the novel is for that. And therefore, a lot of the time, novelists would speak about how, and therefore they don't feel that there is place for AI generated fiction because it's not capable of giving that same connection to one another. Even if you don't know, as Kate was just saying, even if you don't know that there isn't a human behind it, perhaps you get a feeling of loneliness when you're reading the writing, or there's something not quite there that doesn't allow you to connect. So I do think it is interesting to think about how AI generated fiction maybe changes that centering of humanity and connection in literature, and maybe steers us slightly more towards personalization. What we want, what we see as entertainment, what we want to read about. But again, that draws on the fact that, you know, novels are about allowing us to walk in other people's shoes, and to read widely is a great privilege that we have, to be able to learn about other people's lives and historical scenarios, and possible futures as well.
I think it is a fantastically important question. The answer, of course, is novels are for everything and nothing, in that they bring joy, they give meaning, they encourage empathy, they hold up a mirror to nature, but they also, as Clemmy says, helps us to walk in other people's shoes. They are for entertainment, they are for information, they are, you know, the thing that is so unique, I would say, about the novel, and I write obviously non-fiction and plays as well, is that every novel that is read is a different novel depending on what the reader brings to it. You know, novels are finished by their readers in a way that is not true of any other form of art, I would say. I mean, people who are in art galleries at the moment will be howling at that probably, but we're talking about writing. I'm talking within the context of writing. And that's, I suppose, it does link with my previous answer about this is something that the industry needs to get its head around. There will be a lot of readers who don't care, because what they want is a quick read, a quick story that they've kind of read before. So the same but different, which was always the mantra when I worked in publishing in the 80s. It was like the Holy Grail was the same but different, you know, and that of course is what long series of books are about. You know, it's the same cop, it's the same romantic lead in a slightly different situation. So some of these things are technologically making it quicker and more available to things that have always been happening. But I think the point is to ask ourselves what the novel is for in the context of this revolution that's happening is a good question. We might not yet be able to come up with an answer, but it's a good question to ask, because all the time I've worked, as I'm sure Richard's younger than me, but I've worked in and around publishing for more than 40 years now. And if I had a quid for every time somebody's told me the novel is dead, books are dead, I'd be a very wealthy woman. The point is that there is something so fundamental about what a novel does for the human spirit that it will adapt and it will change, but it will never go away. You know, the novel will never go away, but we do have to protect the writers whose imagination and creativity will produce this work, because in the end, there will be nothing left to scrape. That's the point. There will be nothing left to scrape, because all original work will have been cancelled out. You know, it's that phrase that's always used in AI, slop in, slop out, you know, and that's what we need to do. We need to protect originality.
We have a couple of questions that have come in on originality, and I'll bring them, I'll loop them both together. We have an anonymous contributor who says, can you say a little bit more about protecting daydreaming? There's a comment in the report about making sure that on the national curriculum, we encourage that ability to be creative. How do we make sure that we're keeping that pipeline alive? And then Surin, a PhD student at Cambridge, talks about how new young music producers could have the secret revolutionary sounds. The ones who are not using generative AI may be the ones who will sound fresh. The question then is the same possible in novel writing, that we're going to turn to novelists to really make sure that we're keeping writing fresh and alive? Panel.
I'd love to jump in on that first one if possible, because it's also one of my favorite quotes in the whole report, is that daydreaming should be on the national curricula, which I absolutely love, which is a brilliant quote from Kevin Duffy, who is publisher at Blue Moose Books, which is just one of my favorite publishing houses ever. And everyone should go and buy their books. But yes, I think it's a brilliant point from Kevin, and such an important one, and one that I pick up on in the recommendations of the report, and that Kate picked up in her response, that we must ensure that we maintain that ability for children to have space to develop their creative processes, their organic creative processes. And I do say in the report, obviously, there are great uses of AI in terms of access. But aside from that, we want to ensure that there are also spaces where children are not using AI and allowed to kind of explore their creativity, their imaginative instincts, and to daydream, and space to do that, by themselves, without AI. And I think that is another great quote that someone said that relates to this in the focus groups, is what happened to boredom? Boredom is such a great kind of kindling to the fire of imagination and daydreaming. And a lot of the time now we are overstimulated we are constantly on our phones or on our emails or online, and kids don't have that boredom as much anymore. So how could that kind of help us to continue that creative process, and the benefits that the creative process gives to children's development of empathy and problem solving and critical skills is really important, and something that I touch on in both the findings and the recommendations in the report.
It's a really strong section, I think, of the report. I would say that it also reveals a fundamental misunderstanding, at the risk of sounding too highfalutin, of what art is. Art is the journey to the thing that you have, not just the thing. And a great deal about the discussions around generative AI in terms of novel writing is, well, wouldn't it be great if we could shortcut this? So the idea that it's the output is the only thing that matters, rather than the discovery, which leads to the quality of the output. I'm going to muller the quote, but it's a Samuel Beckett quote, and it's try again, fail again, no matter, fail better. That fundamental to being a novelist is the willingness to fail, for getting it wrong and wrong and wrong, until suddenly you look at this chapter that's been defeating you and you go, of course, that's why this doesn't work. And so therefore, writing a novel is not about output. It's about discovery. And that is incredibly largely about daydreaming and boredom. And that, of course, is why young people are using a lot of AI, not generative AI necessarily, but certainly in terms of research. They are skipping the working things out phase. And without the working things out and without failure, then there is not original art. There is just replica. There's just fakes, really. So, I mean, I think that's a fundamental thing about what it means to be a novelist, and what it means to create any sort of art at all.
Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot. We've got just literally a couple of minutes left. I thank everybody for these great questions. Clemmy's research suggests that half of all novelists think that their future is threatened by generative AI, which means that in the medium term, people suggest that half of novelists would disappear, would stop being able to work as novelists. What novel would you think would be terrible to lose? So what's a book? I'm putting you on the spot. Clemmy did this in her policy forum. She made us all tell a book. And we have about maybe 90 seconds. So no explanations, just titles and authors. What novel do you think you would keep in that?
Wuthering Heights. It's an example of a novel that shouldn't work. It's a big baggy monster. It makes no sense at all. It transformed what it was possible for women to write. It was published in, I think, 1848 or maybe 1847, the year before she died, when she was only 30, Emily Bronte. And it's still read and understood and speaks to the human condition 200 years later.
And we're still making movies out of it. Richard?
Fraction of the Whole by Steve Toltz.
Great. Clemmy?
I love that. Thank you both. I've now realized how torturous a question this is. And I actually have so many that I want to say. And as Gina well knows, I would normally say a Jane Austen book because I'm a Jane Austen nut. But I think now I would say The Offing by Ben Myers, who was originally published by Bloomy's Books, is now published by Bloomsbury, but it is just one of the most magical, beautiful, and transporting books I've ever read.
We have at least 2 novelists on this call. Dr. Collett is also a published novelist as well. I know there are probably many more listening in and many more aspiring novelists. And I just want to say, the novel that I want to save is all of those. I want to save the ones that we have yet to see. And on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Please thank you, Kate and Richard Clemmy, for your amazing hard work on this. Please stay in touch with us at the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy. Thank all of you for being a part of this. You will get a short feedback questionnaire after this session, and we would appreciate it if you could complete that. It will link to a survey that will be sent via the Eventbrite you used to sign up for the event. Please stay in touch for details of future seminars and events. Our updates can be found on our website, which is mctd.ac.uk, along with a copy of the report. And again, thank you for joining us and enjoy your day wherever you are. Thank you.